So pre-orders for the new iPad Pro begin on the 30th, and so I thought I'd discuss my thoughts on the whole 8GB versus 16GB of RAM matter and which one you should go for. So a quick refresher, but basically if you go for the 128, 256 and 512GB versions of the iPad Pro, you get 8GB of RAM, whereas the 1TB and 2TB versions of the iPad Pro get a whopping 16GB of RAM. And while this has begged the question, should you go for the 1TB or 2TB version for 16GB of RAM, which by the way is a whopping $700 more than the base model? And to that basically I think no, you should not go for the 16GB unless you of course utilize 1 or 2TB. If that's too much storage, then get the storage tier that's best for you. And yes, I know a lot of you might be thinking, isn't 16GB of RAM gonna be really handy when Pro Apps launches at WWDC? Well, here's the thing, you should not be buying a product based on future promises and future software. And in the case of Apple, this isn't even a promise. In fact, it's just speculation. We don't know for sure that we're gonna see Pro Apps at WWDC because Apple can decide to not release it this year. I mean, last year we saw a Mac Mini developer kit with an A12Z chip, the same chip in the 2020 and basically the 2018 iPad Pro, running macOS and Final Cut and all those Pro apps, and yet Apple never gave it to us. And so clearly the hardware has always been powerful. Apple has always just decided that, hey, we're not gonna give Final Cut, Logic Pro and Xcode to the iPad. Now yes, I know what some of you might be saying, we have the M1 now, so that basically means that Pro apps have to come because the iPad has a Mac chip. Well, again, that's not necessarily the case because number one, the M1 and the A14X that we heard about in the rumors are identical. We knew that before. Mark Gurman told us a while back the M1 and the A14X would be very, very similar, and iOS 14.5 codes pretty much revealed that. And also, who's to say that Apple included the M1 in the iPad Pro purely for Pro apps? Because of course, there are other advantages to the M1. Number one, it works amazingly well in the marketing. Imagine being someone who's not very tech savvy and sees that Apple just included the chip from their computers, the Macs, in an iPad. That just sounds absolutely insane. It just blows your mind, even though as techies we know that this really isn't mind-blowing because of course the A14X and even Apple's previous mobile chips is pretty similar to the M1. But also, I think the biggest driving force for Apple was the fact that of course using the M1 across 5 different products obviously makes manufacturing much easier and cheaper, but also keeps the R&D cost down because of course Apple has less variation between the chips, and obviously the huge R&D cost that went into developing their first ever Apple Silicon chip for their computers obviously pays them back faster the more machines they use it in, and so that could be a huge driving force for the M1 coming to the iPad. Now another rebuttal point I've seen is that this is the first time Apple's mentioned RAM on a mobile device, because you might have noticed that before this iPad Pro, with every iPad and iPhone before this, Apple never mentioned RAM because iOS and iPadOS were pretty efficient with their RAM, and so it never really matters how much there was, but the fact they mention it now in the specs clearly means something, right? Well, I still don't think that's entirely the case because once again, Apple's creating a story with their marketing. They're basically saying that, hey, we just put the internals of a Mac into the iPad, and so flexing the RAM could be playing into that, but it doesn't mean that we're definitely seeing Pro apps and macOS on the iPad in the near future. In fact, Apple's marketing chief Greg Joswiak basically said, we're not planning to merge the iPad and the Mac. And they said the reason they gave us the M1 in the iPad is purely because it's the most powerful chip, and the iPad Pro deserves to have the best silicon possible. Now yes, I know some of this could be marketing waffle, but I do want to say one thing. I don't think Apple's going to give us macOS on the iPad anytime soon, and so iPadOS is here to stay. And one thing you need to know about iPadOS is that an application can only use 1/3 of the RAM available on a device, whereas on macOS an application can of course use all the RAM available on the device. And so basically what that tells me is that if we do see Pro apps on the iPad, it definitely won't work like it does on Mac. It's going to be either a light version or something optimized for the iPad, and so I'm pretty sure you really won't be taking advantage of 16 gigs of RAM on the iPad. In fact, if RAM was that important, surely Apple would have let us configure that at each storage tier, much like they do with the Macs. Also note, I am pretty sure that if we do see Pro apps at WWDC, there is a very high chance we could see support for older iPad Pros and of course the iPad Air 4, which has 4 gigs of RAM, and so 8 gigs should be plenty, and that's basically my main point. Get the storage tier you need, forget about the RAM, that should not really be an issue, and just don't spend $700 thinking Apple's going to give us Pro apps, because again, that might not be the case. In fact, if you are really worried about RAM, the best thing to do might be to just wait, because of course these iPad Pros ship on the second week of May, and WWDC takes place on the 7th of June, and so that's really only 2 to 3 weeks, and so maybe you could wait to see what they announce at DubDub before, of course, deciding which version you want to buy. Anyways, that's my 2 cents on this RAM situation, but let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Anyways, thank you for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe for the latest Apple news and rumors. Check out the video in the iCard above about rumors regarding iOS and iPadOS 15. And on that note, I'll see you guys in the next one. See ya, peeps.